Not in my house.
Lay down a list of what is wrong, things you told them all along. Pray to God he hears you, and pray to God he hears you. And where did I go wrong? I lost a friend somewhere along in the bitterness.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Backfired, an NBA history podcast about bad teams, bad luck, and bad decisions. My name is Lewis, and today will be part 2 of a series that I started a few weeks ago, talking about all the major playoff upsets pulled off by 7 and 8 seeds since 1984, which again was the first season that each conference had 8 teams in the playoffs, first season that the top seeds in each conference did not get a bye in the first round. In this episode, I decided to focus in on one specific playoff series because first off, there are a lot of interesting characters in this series that I think deserve a closer look. And second, we just might be on the eve of the NBA's official announcement that the Seattle SuperSonics are coming back. They're allegedly planning on making that announcement at one of the Clippers preseason games at Climate Pledge Arena in Seattle. And the first one is tomorrow, Friday night. So let's hope that's true so I don't look like a dummy here. But this series involved the Seattle SuperSonics, and it's one that I alluded to last week in the Bison Deli episode. In 1994, the 8th-seeded Denver Nuggets defeated the number 1 seed Seattle SuperSonics in the first round. And this is the first time that an 8 seed ever defeated a 1 seed in NBA history. And before we get started, the Sonics and the Nuggets, mortal enemies in this series, but in real life, no one does Nuggets better than Sonic. That's right. Today's episode is brought to you by Sonic Drive-In. Go try their new 100% breast meat, white meat, chicken nuggets. Wash it down with the strawberry Oreo freezer. Anyway, that was stupid. So the Sonics came into the 1993-94 season as one of the title favorites after having just lost a heartbreaking Western Conference Finals against the Phoenix Suns in the 93 playoffs. Every time that the Suns punched, the Sonics gave a counterpunch, but with the Suns having home court advantage, the Sonics simply ran out of games. And what I mean by that is the Suns won games 1, 3, 5, and the decisive game 7, where Charles Barkley put up a stat line that I still cannot fully comprehend: 44 points and 24 rebounds. He had a triple-double of points, defensive rebounds, and offensive rebounds. That is insanity. MVP shit. That's why he won it that year. So according to Sports Odds History, coming into 1994, the Sonics had an over-under win total of 54.5, second only in the West to the Phoenix Suns, who were at 55.5, and third in the league to the Knicks, whose over-under was set at 56. And at the beginning of the season, they also had the third highest championship odds behind Phoenix and New York, but at the start of the playoffs, they were the odds-on favorites at plus 180. And that predicted success was in part because they had made a couple of key changes to the roster coming into the year. Most of the main rotation stayed the same, but I'll give you 1994's top 8. Gary Payton is the starting point guard. He's in his 4th season out of Oregon State. I think most everybody listening knows about the glove. Outstanding defender. He would be named the Defensive Player of the Year in 1996. Excellent scorer, relentless shit talker, 4th all-time in technical fouls with 250. It's about 1 in every 5 games that he played in his career. He got a tech on average. One of the best point guards of all time and generally regarded as one of the greatest players of all time at any position. And this year, 1994, was his first All-Star season, so he'd be named an All-Star 9 times from the 1994 season to the 03 season. 9 seasons out of 10, he was named an All-Star. He averaged 16.5 points, 6 assists, 2.3 steals per game, and was named first-team All-Defense and third-team All-NBA. Of course, he's also the father of Gary Payton II of the Portland Trail Blazers and the father of Gary Payton Jr. That's right. Gary Payton has 2 sons named after him with 2 different women. That is freak of the week behavior. Congratulations to you, Gary. The starting shooting guard is Kendall Gill from the University of Illinois. Gill was acquired over the summer for 6-man Eddie Johnson, backup point guard Dana Barros, and a first-round pick. Gill wanted to return to Charlotte on a long-term deal, but the Hornets were not interested in bringing him back at his asking price. So he threatened to sign the qualifying offer and leave Charlotte the next summer in unrestricted free agency if they didn't trade him to either Seattle, New York, Atlanta, or the Lakers. And the Hornets finally agreed to trade him, so in order to facilitate the deal, Gill agreed to a 7-year, $26.6 million deal. I'll talk a little bit more about Gill in a little while, but originally, instead of that package that was Johnson, Barros, and the pick, the Hornets really wanted the Sonics starting small forward Derek McKee in exchange for Gill. So instead, the Sonics were able to hold on to McKee for a couple months and trade him to the Indiana Pacers for their new starting small forward Detlef Schrempf. Schrempf was coming off of his first All-Star appearance with the Pacers, as well as his first season as a full-time starter. He'd been the sixth man of the year twice before that. Schrempf is from Germany, but he'd gone to high school in Washington and played college basketball at the University of Washington in Seattle. So this trade actually brought him back to his former home state of Washington. At the 4 is Shawn Kemp, who's sort of a Blake Griffin type, super strong, active, power forward, a lot of violent dunks and blocks. Like Schrempf, Kemp had just earned his first All-Star appearance and would earn 5 more in the next 5 seasons. Kemp averaged about 18 points, which I'm assuming was on about 9 dunks per game, 11 rebounds, 2 blocks, and a steal and a half in 93, and would continue to put up monster numbers in 94. So now here's their center situation. Sam Perkins, who went to North Carolina, he winds up as kind of a hybrid bench and starter big man. He plays both the 4 and the 5 for the Sonics, and they acquired him from the Lakers at the trade deadline in 93 for rookie Doug Christie, who was on the roster but never played, as well as Benoit Benjamin, who I would comp to Hassan Whiteside in that he was a great shot blocker who put up really good numbers, but he was just really lazy, selfish, really a bad teammate. Here's a slice of games from about 3.5 seasons when he was with the Clippers early in his career. So I'm going to round here. 14.5 points, 9 rebounds, 3 blocks per game, and that's a 200-game sample size. The major difference between Benoit Benjamin and Hassan Whiteside is that Benoit was a blue-chip prospect. He was the 3rd overall pick out of Creighton, while Whiteside, of course, didn't get his first real opportunity until about 4 years after he went undrafted out of Marshall. And actually, when Benjamin was drafted in the expansion draft by the Vancouver Grizzlies in 95 and taken off of the hands of the New Jersey Nets, they actually mentioned that, I think in like a media guide or a season ticket holder newsletter or something like that. I forget what exactly, but they mentioned that the loss of Benoit Benjamin was a positive for the Nets going into the season. That was a lot on Benoit Benjamin, huh? Back to Sam Perkins. So he was an absolute flamethrower from 3 on high volume for a 1990s center. 3.3 per game, and he shot about 37% from 3, so certainly an outlier for that era. And the other big man is Michael Cage. He started in the playoffs, but only played about 18 minutes per game. Perkins actually started out the season as the starter, but Cage became the starter again, as he'd been for most of his time in Seattle, because Perkins had a back injury that kept him out of the starting lineup after the All-Star break. Cage was a good rebounder, so much so that his nickname was Windex Man, an allusion to cleaning the glass, of course. Not much of a shot blocker, but a really good defender. I'm surprised that he never made like an all-defensive team, but he was one of the prototypical hustling big men. Cage had joined the Sonics after 4 seasons with the Clippers, who drafted him out of San Diego State. So you got Payton, Gill, Schrempf, Kemp, and the tandem of Cage and Perkins. And then the 2 other guys off the bench were Nate McMillan from NC State, the current Atlanta Hawks coach. McMillan played all 12 seasons of his career in Seattle. He was a very, very solid backup point guard who lost the starting job when Gary Payton came to town. He's kind of like a super sub in my eyes because this season he came off the bench and still was the steals champion with 3 steals per game and was second team all defense. So opposing point guards knew absolutely no peace with the tandem of Gary Payton and Nate McMillan. And then finally, we got a Memphis Tiger. Vincent Askew is another backup guard. Now, the coach of the Sonics is a man we all know and love, Hall of Fame coach, Mr. George Karl, one of the great assholes this game has ever known. He was actually hired mid-season by the Sonics in the 91-92 season. Karl had been the coach of the Cleveland Cavaliers, but was fired in March of his second season, and then was hired by the Golden State Warriors, but then resigned in March of his second season there. So he'd gone back and forth between coaching the Albany Patroons of the Continental Basketball Association and Real Madrid of Liga ACB before getting another shot at coaching in the NBA for Seattle, where he led a mid-season surge that took the Sonics from 20-20 to 47-35 and the 6th seed, where they upset the number 3 Golden State Warriors with Chris Mullin and Tim Hardaway. So obviously, he's a really good coach, but he always just rubs his players the wrong way. Obviously, we know that he doesn't like Carmelo Anthony. He did have a long-running feud with Benoit Benjamin that flared up again in 1995, 2.5 years after he was traded away from the Sonics. But he also feuded with Kendall Gill over playing time and Gill's salary. In 1996, after Gill left the Sonics, he told the New York Times that George Karl was the only person in the world that he has a serious dislike for. That's a quote from him. And that Karl was a big part of the reason that he needed to take a leave of absence to deal with clinical depression. So, I do joke about how big of a jerk Karl is, but he sounds like he was not somebody you'd want to play for. A great basketball mind, but somebody who just can't help from fighting with his players and causing lasting mental and emotional damage to them, like in the case of Kendall Gill. And then finally, the guy who put this team together is Bob Whitsitt. So Whitsitt had become the general manager of the Sonics in 1986 at the age of 30 to help straighten out their salary cap. Since the salary cap had been implemented in 1984, the Sonics had had a lot of trouble with it. So they needed somebody who could understand what was going on in the moment and also plan ahead. And that's part of what Whitsitt excelled at. But the other thing was just the sheer amount of trades that he made. By my count, he made 28 separate trades in his 8 seasons in Seattle, which is a ton of activity. And that earned him the nickname Trader Bob. And he was pretty ballsy. Like, for example, very first move after taking the reins in Seattle was to trade Jack Sikma, who had been the starting center of the Sonics 1979 championship team. Traded Sikma to Milwaukee for draft picks and Alton Lister, who, if you recognize that name from the incredible dunk that Shawn Kemp had on him, Lister was on the Sonics for a few years. But Whitsitt drafting Kemp in the first place was also a huge risk. Kemp was kind of thought of as tainted goods because he was ruled as ineligible to play at Kentucky, and he was only 19 on draft night and had not played a single game in college. So that was a big risk that massively paid off for the Sonics and for Whitsitt. So that is the Sonics. So how about the stars of this episode, the Denver Nuggets? Here's their top 8. Their point guard is the extremely controversial Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf, born Chris Jackson. Mahmoud was the Nuggets' 3rd overall pick out of LSU after averaging 30 and 28 points per game in his 2 seasons in Baton Rouge. Mahmoud is a small, quick point guard who could get a shot off ridiculously fast. And as his scoring numbers from college indicated, he was not shy when it came to pulling the trigger. Mahmoud had finally earned the starting spot in Denver before the 93 season after backing up the even smaller Michael Adams his rookie year and Darius Garland's dad, Winston Garland, in 92. Now, the reason that I say Mahmoud is controversial had not happened just yet, although anytime an American public figure converts to Islam and changes their name, certainly that's a lightning rod for hate speech. But in 1996, Mahmoud would make the national news, be suspended indefinitely, and essentially be blackballed from the league for declining to stand for the Star-Spangled Banner, saying that the American flag is a symbol of oppression and tyranny, and saying that standing for the flag was fundamentally incompatible with his faith. So for that reason, Mahmoud is definitely one of the most interesting players in the history of the league to me, sort of the original Colin Kaepernick in a way. At shooting guard is Bryant Stith, the 13th overall pick out of UVA in the 92 draft. One of many really good shooting guards in that deep draft, as I mentioned when talking about Harold Miner 2 weeks ago in the Miami Heat episode. Miner was one of the few bad shooting guards in that first round. The 92 draft, though, was awesome. Ton of talent. Not the most star-laden draft of all time. 5 all-stars in this draft. Just a ton of competent NBA players in this draft, especially the first round, of course. Stith being one of them. Stith is the all-time leading scorer in UVA history. He averaged over 19 a game across all of his 4 seasons. Just a solid NBA player as well. Mostly a bench guy outside of a dozen starts in his rookie season because of a broken bone in his foot that he sustained 5 minutes into the 7th game of the season, which was his first start. That kept him out until around the All-Star break, but now in his 2nd season as a Nugget, he has earned the starting role and would play all 82 games. Reggie Williams was the small forward. He was the 4th overall pick out of Georgetown in the 87 draft, but had been kind of disappointing for the Los Angeles Clippers. He was unloaded to Cleveland in 1989 alongside the rights to 2nd overall pick Danny Ferry, who refused to sign with the Clippers and played a season in Italy instead. Williams landed on the Cavs and was waived after 32 games. Lenny Wilkins, who was the coach at the time, said that he was just too inconsistent to be a good option at backup guard. Went to the Spurs, got waived right before Christmas of 1990, the day before his contract would have become fully guaranteed. Hate that. So dropped by 3 different teams in the span of 3 1/4 seasons. But right after New Year's in 1991, he signs with the Nuggets and just absolutely goes off. So in LA, he had about 10 points per game on 40% shooting, with Cleveland and San Antonio, he's putting up fewer than 7 points per game in fewer minutes. And all of a sudden, he goes to Denver 2 weeks after he's waived by the Spurs, and he becomes the starter and puts up 16 a game on better shooting, albeit on a worse team than the Cavs or the Spurs. But by the time the 94 season rolled around, he'd become a key part of a steadily improving Nuggets team that was making the playoffs for the first time since 1990. The power forward is LaFonso Ellis, the 5th pick out of Notre Dame in the 1992 draft. The Nuggets' other first-rounder in the draft that they got Bryant Stith in. Stith was a pick they'd acquired from the New Jersey Nets, but Ellis was their own pick, their prize for winning just 24 games in 92. They did fall back a spot in the projected draft order because of the Charlotte Hornets' stroke of luck that saw them jump from 8th to 2nd so they could pick Alonzo Mourning. But LaFonso Ellis was a day one starter, started all 82 games in his rookie year, putting up about 15 and 9. And he was great in this season, which was his second year as well, 15.5 and 8.5, while shooting over 50% from the field. And now the big man, one of my absolute favorites, Dikembe Mutombo, the 4th pick in the draft out of Georgetown, born in Leopoldville 6 days before the city's name was changed to Kinshasa, the capital of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, formerly the Belgian Congo, formerly the Republic of Zaire. Dikembe Mutombo is well known for his low, rumbling voice and his signature finger wag that he did after every block, which he was fantastic at. 4.1 blocks per game in his 3rd season in the NBA. He put up 12 points, 12 rebounds, and 4 blocks per game. Just an absolute monster. About to enter a stretch where he would win Defensive Player of the Year 4 times in 7 years. It is hard to overstate just how great Dikembe Mutombo was on defense. He was far and away the Nuggets' best player, which everybody on the Nuggets would agree with, by the way, despite not having a great offensive package. You think about Rudy Gobert and how he's, an instant defensive identity. Mutombo is the same way, but he was a better shot blocker than Rudy Gobert was in terms of the sheer number. Part of that is because the game in the 90s was more focused on post-ups, so he had many, many more opportunities than Gobert did to block shots. But by the way, one thing that I didn't know about Dikembe Mutombo, he did not come over to the USA until he was 21 years old or so. He enrolled at Georgetown in the ESL program to become a doctor. John Thompson over at Georgetown convinced him to play basketball, and then he was incredible from the jump. He played in the NBA from the time he was 25 until he was 42. So pretty good decision for both John Thompson and Dikembe Mutombo, I would say. And then coming off the bench, there's a couple of guys I talked about last week. Bison Dele from Arizona, playing as Brian Williams still. He was salary dumped to the Nuggets so that they could sign Penny Hardaway to his rookie contract. Bison was a super energetic player when he was fully engaged, and he certainly was in this season, which was his 3rd season in the league. 8 points, 5.5 rebounds per game as Dikembe Mutombo's backup, dunking everything. Rodney Rogers, who was a rookie shooting guard from Wake Forest, whom the Nuggets drafted with the 9th pick in 93. And then Robert Pack from USC, who was in his 3rd year. He played his rookie season with Portland, but was acquired in the 92-93 preseason for a 2nd-round pick. And maybe it's just because of my subconscious bias in favor of Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf because he's so interesting to me. I think to myself, from day one, Mahmoud should have been a starter and, kind of discounted what Winston Garland and Robert Pack were as players. I did not know that Robert Pack was this guy, but he was absolutely huge for them in this playoff series. I'll go into that more in a little bit. The head coach at the Denver Nuggets is Dan Issel, Kentucky Wildcats legend, Kentucky Colonels legend, one of the great ABA players of all time, won a title in 1975 with the Colonels, was moved to Denver while they were still in the ABA, and then played with them for their first 9 seasons in the NBA. Issel is 2nd all-time in ABA scoring, 12th all-time in combined NBA and ABA scoring, just behind Carmelo Anthony. Hard to imagine, these days, somebody coming into the NBA scoring 30 points per game and leading their team to Game 7 of the finals, as a rookie. But my God, the ABA was absolutely insane. After Issel retired, he was a broadcaster for a little bit and then eventually became the coach of the Nuggets. Not a very good coach, at least by record. I have a Dan Issel episode in the works, so, I'll talk about that more in a later episode. And finally, the man who put this team together was Bernie Bickerstaff, who is everywhere in NBA history all the time. It was impossible to escape Bernie Bickerstaff. At least I like him more than I like his son. What do you know? Bernie Bickerstaff was the head coach of the Seattle SuperSonics from 1985 to 1990. So I mentioned him in part one of this series. He engineered the first 7-2 upset in 1987 when his Seattle SuperSonics defeated the Mavericks. But then Bickerstaff left the Sonics to become the president and the general manager of the Nuggets in 1990, which is a position that he'd hold for 7 years. But Bernie built, this entire rotation in Denver outside of Mahmoud, who there was some tension between Bickerstaff and Mahmoud because of Mahmoud's Tourette's syndrome, which interfered with things sometimes. But Bernie Bickerstaff was hired 2 weeks after the 1990 draft. So technically the only player in the rotation that was not drafted or otherwise acquired by Bickerstaff was Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf. But yeah, Bickerstaff has a hand in both the first 7-2 upset and the first 8-1 upset. So let's get into the team profiles, go under the hood a little bit. Let's start with Seattle. They were 63-19, middle of the pack in pace, second in offense, third in defense, elite at 6 of the 8 offensive and defensive four factors, middle of the pack in defensive rebounding, which, spoiler alert, Dikembe Mutombo would take advantage of, and almost at the bottom of the league at sending opponents to the free throw line. So they sent their opponents to the line way, way, way too much. But that really didn't hurt them throughout the regular season, even with their starting center position kind of being in flux, which, very important position in 1994. They had a great season, started off 10-0, 26-3. They held the first or the second seed for the vast majority of the season. They battled Houston and San Antonio for the top seed for a little while and jostled around in between 1 and 3 for a few weeks. But finally, at the end of the season, pulled away, finished the season on a 25-5 run in their last 30 games. That is a 69 win pace. Nice. And then let's talk about Denver, the opposite of Seattle in many respects. They were 42-40. 7th in pace, only about 1 possession per game more than the Sonics. 20th in offense, turned the ball over a ton. 5th in defense, due in large part to the presence of Dikembe Mutombo. As a team, really didn't let their opponents hit shots very much. 2nd best defensive effective field goal percentage in the league, and they were the 6th best team when it came to defensive rebounding. So again, thank you, Dikembe. So, they didn't give their opponents very many second chance opportunities. From New Year's Day onward, the Nuggets were the 8th seed, 14-14 on January 2nd, lost 8 of 10, won 4, traded off wins and losses for the rest of the year, win 2, lose 4, win 3, lose a couple. But they were never in danger of either losing their playoff status or moving up into the, 6 or 7 seed. The Lakers were between 4 and 10 games behind them for the entire season, and the Warriors and Blazers were trading position about 5 games ahead of them. So they were kind of alone in no man's land. You could say that they were consistently inconsistent. They were consistent in their seed, but as I mentioned, a really uninspiring offensive performance that season. Couldn't put together anything on offense outside of going to the free throw line, which I mentioned that Seattle struggled to keep their opponents off the line. The Nuggets went to the line 2nd most in the league. However, they were an abysmal free throw shooting team outside of Mahmoud and Bryant Stiff. They were also the youngest team in the league, average age of 24.8. So, that was kind of to be expected, but basically nobody on the team had any playoff experience. So in the playoff series between the Sonics and the Nuggets was officially official, as it had been for most of the season. I mentioned that the Sonics were the favorites to win the title at plus 180. They were also the massive favorites, of course, to win the series against the Nuggets. They were minus 2,000. By implied probability, they had about a 1 in 3 shot at winning the title and a 95% chance of winning the series against the Nuggets. And I don't think, just because it was so new to have like a 7 and 8 seed, I don't think people thought about 8 versus 1 matchups in the NBA the way that we used to think about 16-1 matchups in March Madness, before UMBC dominated UVA a few years ago. I don't think that it was impossible at the time to imagine a 1 seed losing in the first round, but historically, a 1 seed had a cakewalk in the first round. It's just the way that it is. So game 1 and game 2 were more of the same for 1 seeds facing 8 seeds, especially a 60-plus win team. They completely blew Denver out of the water in game 1, 106-82. Bison Dele had a team high 15 points for the Denver Nuggets. Detlef Schrempf had 21 points on 6 shots. That is insane. 13 of 14 from the free throw line. As you can imagine, a lot of the Nuggets were in foul trouble that game. Reggie Williams fouled out in just 18 minutes. The Sonics were matchup hunting Dikembe Mutombo, which on its face sounds like a bad idea, but they were successful in game 1 at getting Mutombo to venture out onto the perimeter to guard Shawn Kemp, who of course is much faster than Dikembe Mutombo is. So they had Mutombo not really playing to his strengths there. That allowed Seattle's guards to have just extra, split seconds here and there getting to the rim before Mutombo headed back to the paint. So that was something that Payton and Ricky Pierce, who's another bench guard, were able to take advantage of. The Sonics shot 50 free throws in total. It was an absolute drubbing. The Sonics had playoff experience, and the Nuggets just really weren't sure how to match the Sonics' intensity at first. Per Nate McMillan, the Sonics had felt really disrespected by the national media coverage and took it out on the Nuggets. Nobody thought that the Nuggets were going to beat the Sonics or anything like that. Although the Sonics players were careful about being overly boastful, they had a lot of nice things to say about the Nuggets defense in the days leading up to the playoffs. But a lot of prominent voices in the national media thought that the Suns were going to make the finals and possibly win the championship with Michael Jordan and the Chicago Bulls out of the picture in the East. But as we know, the Suns did not make the finals in 94. They didn't even make the conference finals in 94 because they lost to the eventual champion Houston Rockets in the second round. Now, when Game 2 rolled around, the Sonics were clearly unable to channel the same rage that they had felt before Game 1 because they and the Nuggets both played a really, really sloppy game, which the Sonics won 97-87. Both teams shot 39% from the field and 64% from the line. But Seattle got 17 more free throws in that game. Nobody was hitting shots this game. Here's some of the shooting performances. Shawn Kemp, 4 for 14. Kendall Gill, 3 for 11. Sam Perkins, 3 for 10. Reggie Williams, 3 for 15. Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf, 5 for 15. It was just gross. Still, though, even being down 2-0 in a best-of-5 playoff series, they truly believed that they were going to win that series. Reggie Williams said after the sloppy Game 2, quote, "We feel confident that we can beat this team. We showed tonight that we could play aggressive and physical with them. We made some mistakes tonight, but we were right there." And, Reggie was right. Game 3 rolled around, and on the brink of elimination, the Nuggets, were able to find something within themselves. So they had returned home to Denver after 2 games on the road and defeated the Sonics 110-93. And this was a weird game for Seattle. Shawn Kemp shot 3 of 11, and Gary Payton only got up 6 shots. And those two were emblematic of the larger trends of this game. So the Sonics only got up 73 field goal attempts in this game, way down from their regular season average of 84 a game. And the Nuggets were a little bit more extreme. They averaged about 83 shots per game in the regular season, but slowed things down to a crawl in Game 3 and shot only 68 shots. The key difference between the two teams' performances, though, was that Denver shot 60% from the field, while Seattle shot like 43%. Reggie Williams was the hero of this game. He put up an efficient 31 points with 6 rebounds and 8 assists. Dikembe had 19 points, 13 rebounds, and 6 blocks. And the Nuggets really flexed their defensive muscles, as you can tell, not letting a lot of shots off, slowing down the game to a crawl, completely dominating the Mutombo-Kemp matchup that Seattle dominated in Game 1. Now, even though they were still in complete control of the series, the Sonics were a little concerned after Game 3. The intensity that they showed in Game 1 that the Nuggets couldn't match, that dynamic was completely flipped. George Karl and Gary Payton both told the papers that they hadn't played a playoff quality game in Game 3, but they were going to right their wrongs in Game 4, which they did for the most part until overtime came, when the Nuggets pulled away thanks to a back-breaking dunk from LaFonso Ellis that put the Nuggets up 5 and ended any hope of a comeback for Seattle. The Nuggets won 94-85, and that set up a winner-take-all Game 5. Dan Issel said after the game, quote, "I've told our guys since the first game that if we can get it to a 5th game, anything can happen. I'm sure Seattle will be happy to get back to their home court, but we are not conceding anything to them." And that home court, of course, made a difference. Denver was 5,000 feet higher in the air than Seattle was. And some of the players complained about the altitude difference, which some say takes several weeks to get fully acclimated to. And several weeks is something that opposing NBA playoff teams simply do not have. They have to get acclimated to it in a couple days. Impossible. But yeah, this was the worst case scenario for Seattle. They almost closed it out and would have gotten some rest before going on to face the Utah Jazz, where their lungs would be acclimated to the similar but less severe altitude shift in Salt Lake City. But instead, they had been put on their heels by a young, scrappy Nuggets team that had survived 2 elimination games and now had a shot at eliminating them. So now it's Game 5. I highly suggest that you go watch the highlights of Game 5 or even the full game. It's one of the hardwood classic NBA TV games, so it is on YouTube. The highlights really bring home just how huge Robert Pack and Bison Dele were in this game, both from a statistical perspective and just energy, how the team fed off of everything that those two did. Bison Dele had a ton of really important putbacks in this game and emotional dunks. He finished with 17 points and 19 rebounds. Robert Pack absolutely went off. He had a couple of high-flying dunks. He hit 3 3-pointers. Dikembe Mutombo had 8 blocks. After going back and forth the whole game, no team outscored each other by any more than 2 points in the first through fourth quarters. And the Nuggets, at the end of overtime, were the ones left standing. The Sonics, at the end of the game, they're frantically hoisting up 3-pointers, and Dikembe Mutombo finally grabbed the ball, did not let go until well after the final buzzer of the Nuggets' 98-94 victory. And after the buzzer sounded, he just collapsed to the ground and burst into tears. Amazing, super fun to watch, historic, and this was a franchise-altering loss for the Sonics. Although they would make the finals in 1996 and face off against Michael Jordan and the Bulls, they lost in the first round again in 1995, this time to a pretty interesting Lakers team that had Nick Van Exel, Cedric Ceballos, and Vlade Divac, all those guys. But the architect of the Sonics, Bob Whitsitt, depending on who you ask, he was either fired or resigned, and he had the choice that summer of either going up I-5 to become Vancouver's first basketball executive or going down I-5 to build a contender in Portland. Trader Bob chose Portland, and he built the teams that we know now as the Jailblazers. Now, for the Nuggets, who went on to face the Utah Jazz, they went down 3-0 in that series, but then forced a Game 7 that they only lost by 10 points. So you'd think maybe this could have been the start of something big for them, That was not the case, though. 94 was a lightning in a bottle moment for Denver because the next season, they did make the playoffs again, but they were swept by the Spurs in the first round. They also had a coaching change. Bernie Bickerstaff was their head coach as well as the executive because Dan Issel had been fired in the middle of the season. More on that in the Dan Issel episode. And then after that, they missed the playoffs 8 consecutive seasons, including one of the worst single seasons in NBA history, which was their 11-win 1998 campaign. The Nuggets didn't make the playoffs again until Carmelo Anthony came around and led them to the playoffs in 2004. So a few key takeaways from this series to close us out. Shawn Kemp was really not good in this series. He put up 15 points, 10 rebounds, 2 steals, 2.5 blocks, only 37% from the field. He was a consistent rebounder, but got in foul trouble in games 3 and 4. Really just didn't come through for the Sonics at all in this series, which is a real disappointment because in the conference finals in 93, against the Suns, he had been really, really good. Sam Perkins and Michael Cage, the Sonics big men, really started to look their age. Both of them were 32 years old. Perkins stayed in the league for 7 more seasons, including 4 in Seattle, but his role shrank every season except for an uptick in playing time in the playoffs during both the Sonics finals run in 96 and then again with the Pacers during their finals run in 2000. Michael Cage, though, was done in Seattle. He left free agency for Cleveland and was traded a couple times, wound up in New Jersey and Philadelphia, but really didn't accomplish much else in his career after leaving Seattle. Detlef Schrempf was the star of the show for Seattle in this series. Really good pickup for them. He played 6 seasons in Seattle until he also went down I-5 to join Trader Bob in Portland. Detlef was the Sonics leading scorer in the series, 18.5 per game on efficient shooting. Good on you, Detlef. Here's one that I did not know. Maybe this is news to you as well. I did not know before researching this episode that Gary Payton was a really bad free throw shooter. For a guard, he was really, really, really bad. Career 73% shooter, under 60% on the season in 94. And in this series, he shot 42%. That's disgusting. This is your starting point guard shooting 42% from the free throw line in a playoff series. Dikembe Mutombo, on twice as many attempts, shot better than 42%. And Dikembe Mutombo is a horrible free throw shooter. Jesus Christ. And then finally, Dikembe Mutombo averaged over 6 blocks per game in this series, had 8 blocks in each of games 4 and 5. Phenomenal. 5.75 blocks per game for the entire playoffs in 1994, 12 games in total. That gave him a grand total in the playoffs of 69 blocks. And again, to that, I say nice. So that's going to be it for me. Hope you enjoyed. Hope you learned something. Hope you're entertained. Appreciate you very much for listening. Go on and follow the socials if you'd like, at Backfired NBA Pod on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. I thought that I was shadow banned on TikTok. Turns out I'm not. I posted several bangers in the last few days, so go check those out. If you're not a TikTok user, I'm posting them over on Instagram as well. Get in on the ground floor, folks. Someday it's going to cost $500 to listen to an episode of this show, so live it up while it's free. But yeah, that's it for me. Thank you again for listening, and we will talk next week. Have a good one.